The first thing the archivist noticed was the absence. A ledger's spine sliced clean from its binding, a docket that skipped from August 12 to August 19, as if a week had never happened, a medical journal whose page numbers leapt forward with no apology. In the Beaufort district of South Carolina, 1847 was a year with a hole in it, one that planters remembered in whispers and their descendants refused to name. All that remained were the edge shadows of what had been cut away. Impressions of handwriting on the following leaf, ink ghosts where damp fingers had once turned a violent page. From these absences and from letters and bills of sale that somehow slipped the fire, emerges the outline of a woman the records tried to erase. The documents that survived call her only Sarah. The people who feared her called her tall as trouble. History, when it spoke at all, called her impossible. Before her, there was a house that worshipped order. Riverton Hall sat 7 miles inland from the Sea Islands, just far enough from the salt wind to forget the ocean, and close enough to feel its storms. Under the care of Marcus Grayson Planter, ledger keeper, a man who believed that numbers were a cure for chaos, the place became an experiment in control. He had inherited the acreage and a mandate from an uncle who trusted process more than prayer. Modernize, maximize, make the earth yield. Grayson obliged with a fervor that passed for faith. He wrote everything down, pounds of cotton per hand per day, ounces of meal per person per week, punishments administered, minutes apart. He measured the windows of the slave cabins and the width of the corridors between them. He weighed the iron for restraints and noted when it was replaced. The ledgers that remain guarded now in reading rooms where you must sign your name and wash your hands are disturbingly calm. Human life appears there as columns that balance. To understand how a single night could unmake a careful world, you have to know the tightness of the knot Grayson lived inside. Beaufort's planters had money like a spell and anxiety like a fever. Sea Island cotton made fortunes that announced themselves on Charleston piazzas, but the arithmetic beneath those fortunes kept every master awake. In some places, the enslaved outnumbered the enslavers 10 to 1. Men like Grayson built systems to keep their fear at bay. Routine patrols, preventive discipline, consultations with physicians who preferred calipers to conscience. Grayson's pride was that he could turn people into predictability. That pride would become the hinge of his ruin. His overseers, 4 at the start of that summer, were exponents of the same belief, men who considered vigilance a craft and violence a tool. The head man, Tobias Finch of Virginia, had the reputation planters hired for. He could smell an escape before it started. Under him worked 3 younger men, Huxley, Crenshaw, Vernon, each with the hard expression of those who learn early that certainty is safer than thought. The quarters were quiet that year not because hearts had gentled, but because habits had hardened. It is possible, reading Grayson's neat handwriting, to mistake silence for peace. And then, a letter arrived from Charleston. It was written by a factor who specialized in goods not listed in polite advertisements, a man who knew which estate sales held rarities and which courthouses would speed a bill of sale if you added the right names to the margin. He addressed Grayson with flattering precision, a planter of progressive inclinations, and described a woman available at a price that announced what she was: $3,000, cash. She stood, the factor wrote, more than 7 feet in height, powerful in a way that made ordinary iron a suggestion rather than a fact. She had proven difficult to manage in Virginia and was to be moved quietly. The letter appealed exactly to Grayson's vanity, an anomaly to be normalized, a problem that could prove his method. The journey he made to the city a few days later is preserved in a handful of lines: date, purchase, witnesses, but the absence of description says more than any embellishment. Those who saw her in that warehouse remembered the rattle of specially forged chains, and the moment the doctor who had been summoned to attest soundness fell back half a step when she raised her eyes to meet his. The bill of sale lists her as Sarah, age uncertain, sold as is, no family, no past, no promises. From the page where a seller wrote those words, the indentations of a different hand, the doctors pressed through, measurements of limb and skull, quotations about density and temperament. The paper keeps both voices, merchant and medicine, like 2 hands gripping the same human being for different reasons. The wagon that carried her to Riverton Hall had been altered for size and fear, high-sided, floor ringed with anchor points, guards riding alongside rather than behind. The iron cuffs at her wrists and ankles were 4 inches wide, the chain between them as thick as a man's thumb. When the wagon turned into the main yard, work slowed in invisible ways. Tools were set down a fraction softer, heads tilted in directions that did not look like staring. No command had gone out, but every person not tied to a task found a reason to be where their eyes could measure the distance between the wagon and its destination. Later, in testimonies reluctant and rare, they would struggle to explain what they felt. It wasn't wonder, not exactly. It was the discomfort of seeing fear change sides. Grayson had prepared a room. He would have called it a secure cell off one of the storage buildings. The window was barred, the door was braced. A floor ring waited for the end of the chain like a mouth for a bit. Tobias Finch argued for a location farther from the quarters. Grayson refused. The point was to demonstrate that the system contained everything. He wanted people to see the lesson. He needed them to witness that there was no edge to his control. In the 3 days that followed, the plantation moved as if under glass. Sarah was fed, examined, observed. The local physician, Samuel Pritchard, whose public reports read like anatomy and whose private journals read like unease, took notes with professional neatness. He recorded that she did not pant after exertion when others would, that her reactions to pain were unreadable, that she answered no questions in English or French, that her eyes did not flit but tracked, patient as a surveyor's line. He wrote, in an entry he did not intend for a magistrate's eyes, that the woman's silence created a profound sensation of uncertainty, as if the room itself had been mismeasured. On the 4th morning, Grayson stepped into ritual. He assigned her to the western fields under Huxley, lighter chains to allow labor, orders to test compliance in public view. The day would end with columns in a ledger, numbers to reassure a man who believed in them. But the ledger for that day is one of the pages torn out, the sequence interrupted, the arithmetic aborted. In its place, we have only edges, the testimony that Huxley struck her to establish understanding, the observation that she did not flinch, the way the hand that wrote those words pressed harder on the second line than the first, a pressure ghost that admits the moment the writer realized the story might not obey the template. That night, as the quarters closed and the lamps were trimmed and the sounds of 1,000 small, tired motions settled into a rhythm overseers could read, Finch gathered his men. The phrase he used in his log, comprehensive orientation, survives only because someone copied it before the page was removed. 2 enslaved men, Jupiter from the stables, Abraham from the cotton house, were told to stand guard outside the door. Later, one would say that what he heard in that hour was worse than screams. The other would say that the silence inside was the loudest thing he had ever known. But that belongs to the night to come. For now, the story is still afternoon, and the sky is still the pale, pitiless blue that bleaches color from the world. A man who believes in procedure believes also in tomorrows. He expects that his rules will carry him across the hours like a bridge. He does not yet know that bridges have weight limits, and that he has invited more weight than his structure can bear. When the letter arrived from Charleston, Grayson let himself smile when no one could see him. It is a small note in a margin, opportunity, but the ink has spread slightly into the paper, a tiny halo that looks like eagerness. The factor had promised him a demonstration case, a test only the most disciplined could pass. Grayson loved tests. He believed they proved not just strength but rightness. He dipped his pen in ink, wrote his agreement, and sealed a future that the men of his class would spend years trying to deny had ever happened. In the archive, the wax stain is still visible. Night will fall soon, and with it, the reckoning the ledgers do not compute. But before we cross into that darkness, the record will show one final, ordinary thing. A supper taken without appetite, a set of keys checked by habit, a last round of the yard where every door is touched to feel that it is shut. The world at Riverton Hall is, for a few more hours, exactly as Marcus Grayson designed it to be: tight, measured, and sure of itself. The last line in his journal that day is simple: all in order. Then the page ends, and the next page was cut out. The letter from Charleston sits closed on his desk, the seal broken and folded back so the words can be reread without ceremony. He intends to keep it, to show it later, perhaps, as proof of his foresight. He does not yet know that the only words anyone will remember from it are the ones no one thought important. She is unusually strong. Chains have been made to suit. The system, confident in its iron, sleeps. The woman it believes it holds is counting hinges. Dusk gathers at the edges of the fields. The first moths find the lamps. Somewhere a child is hushed. Somewhere a whip is coiled and hung. In the storage building, the air smells of oil and iron, and a ring in the floor waits to earn its keep. Outside the door, two men shift their weight from foot to foot and tell themselves that quiet means control. Across the yard, the main house windows burn rectangles into the dark. And on a desk inside, beside a ledger and a folded letter and a pen that believes it will be used again in the morning, a thin curl of wax on paper hardens into history. The wagon from Charleston arrived under the same sun that had burned over Riverton Hall for 100 years. But the day it rolled in, the air felt heavier, like the heat had found a new shape to cling to. The iron wheels cut grooves into the clay road, the same road that carried bales of cotton out and bodies in. Word had spread for days through the quarters that something was coming, not someone's something. A woman taller than two men standing shoulder to shoulder, a creature the master bought for $3,000, a giant meant to break the ground faster than a mule team. Rumor worked its way through the campfires like smoke, impossible to see directly but impossible to ignore. Marcus Grayson had arranged the scene carefully. The wagon would stop in the main yard, where everyone could see. He wanted order, fear disguised as lesson. To him, this was theater. To the people who watched, it felt like omen. When the wagon doors opened, even the cicadas seemed to pause. The figure that stepped down was bound in chains that glowed dull red in the sun, freshly forged iron not yet cooled to the color of habit. Each cuff was so wide it covered half her forearm. The chain between her wrists could have moored a small boat. The men who escorted her, two guards, both armed, both pale with unease, looked less like captors and more like men walking beside a force they didn't fully believe in. Sarah. That was the name on the bill of sale. No last name, no birthplace, no note of language or family. Just Sarah. But what stepped from the wagon did not move like a slave or a captive. She stepped like a measurement, something precise, inevitable. Her skin was dark bronze, almost metallic in the light. Her eyes, when they lifted, scanned the yard, not with pleading, not even with hatred, but with the slow, exact focus of someone memorizing the architecture of a trap. Later, Dr. Pritchard would write that she looked as though she were counting. Others who saw her that day remembered the same expression. A woman measuring everything: distance, direction, weakness. Behind the main house, the fields stretched like a sea of green punishment. Cotton stalks bowed in the heat. The smell of river mud and sweat carried through the yard. Grayson stood on the steps of his porch, watching her, his journal already open. He would later record, height verified at 7 feet 2 inches, condition robust, eyes suggest intelligence beyond station. To him, that last note was compliment and warning both. He had spent years turning labor into arithmetic. His plantation was a map of ratios, hours to yield, meal to work, punishment to obedience. Now, before him, stood an equation he did not understand. The other enslaved people stayed at a distance, pretending to work, though their attention drifted. Dina, a washerwoman with arms roped from years at the river, would later testify. She looked at us like she was looking through us, like we were part of something she'd already counted. Jupiter, the stable hand, said. She didn't blink. She saw the chains like she'd seen them before. Grayson motioned to Finch. The overseer, a man who wore his authority like armor, nodded to his men to move her to the holding room, a former storage chamber near the smithy. He had argued to keep her far from the quarters, but Grayson had refused. The master wanted her visible. They need to see what control looks like, he said. Finch had nodded, but his eyes stayed on Sarah the whole time, narrowing slightly, as if realizing that control was not what was on display. Inside the holding room, Sarah was secured to a floor ring embedded in oak planks, iron bolted to timber. The air smelled of salt and old oil. When the door shut, the noise of the chain echoed once, like a church bell struck wrong. Finch wrote in his own logbook later that night, subject compliant, expression unreadable, silence unsettling. The first day passed in observation. Grayson and Dr. Pritchard visited mid-morning. The doctor brought his instruments, calipers, a weighted grip tester, a notebook lined in red. He recorded her limb lengths, bone density, pulse rate. He pricked her arm to watch how fast she bled. She neither winced nor flinched. When he asked questions in English, then in halting French, she gave no reply. When he turned away, she studied the door hinges. He noted this detail without understanding its meaning. Pritchard would later tell a colleague, her stillness was unnatural, like an animal waiting not for escape, but for understanding. By the second day, Finch complained she made the men nervous. They said her silence followed them out of the building, into their meals, into their dreams. Grayson ordered more frequent checks. Familiarity breeds predictability, he said, a line he must have thought clever. On the third day, when Finch brought her food, she looked at him for the first time, long enough for him to notice the color of her eyes, amber with green edges. It unsettled him enough that he closed the door faster than he meant to. That night, he told the others that she wasn't simple, that she was thinking behind the eyes. Huxley laughed, called him superstitious. Finch didn't laugh back. Marcus Grayson's journals from those days survive almost intact. He wrote about her strength as though describing machinery. Grip measured at 180 pounds. Force. Excellent subject for study. He wrote nothing about the way she watched his reflection in the window as he wrote. On the fourth morning, he decided the experiment must progress. Observation was not enough. Control must be tested. He ordered Finch to fit her with lighter chains and send her to the western fields. Huxley was assigned direct supervision. Finch protested it was too soon, but Grayson cut him off. I want her visible in the rows. Let the others see obedience from a giant. Huxley found her kneeling as he adjusted the cuffs. The chain links clattered like punctuation. When he struck her across the face, to set the tone, as he phrased it later, she did not flinch. He struck again, harder. Still nothing. No reaction, no sound. He stepped back, shaken without knowing why. That afternoon, she worked faster than any 3 workers combined. The overseers watched from the edge of the field, whispering to each other. Even the other laborers moved differently, more careful, less talk. The rhythm of the plantation had shifted, though no one could say how. When dusk came, Finch decided they needed to clarify discipline. He ordered Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon to meet him at the storage room after nightfall. Orientation, he called it. But the word was a disguise for fear. Something about her silence had gotten inside their heads. At 9 p.m., the 4 men gathered outside her door, each carrying the tools of their trade: whips, batons, leather straps, and in Finch's coat, a pair of thumbscrews forbidden by state law but favored by cruelty. They ordered Jupiter and Abraham to stand guard. Neither wanted to, but refusal meant lashes. The men went inside. The door closed. The sounds that followed were familiar at first, the rhythm of pain, the plantation knew by heart. Leather on skin, metal scraping wood, Finch's voice, commanding. But the rhythm changed. Abraham would later say it was like the sounds forgot their order, like the room itself had started fighting back. Then came a noise that didn't belong in this world. The clang of iron breaking, the cry of men who had never believed they could be afraid, and beneath it all a low, steady sound, not a scream but something deeper, like the world exhaling through clenched teeth. Outside, the guards froze. They didn't move until silence replaced the noise, heavy and final. When the door finally opened, Sarah walked out. Her chains hung loose from her wrists, the links torn apart, one end slick with blood that caught the moonlight. Her breathing was calm but loud in the quiet yard. She looked at Jupiter and Abraham as if deciding whether they existed. Then she turned toward the main path and walked away, slow, steady, each step a declaration. Behind her, the door to the holding room swung open on broken hinges. The light from the single oil lamp flickered against the walls. Abraham turned to look and wished he hadn't. What he saw would haunt him to the end of his life. Sarah didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked toward the blacksmith's forge. The night swallowed the sound of her chains. The fields were still. The overseer's quarters were silent. History would try to erase what happened next, but for now, the record ends here with a woman walking through the yard, her shadow taller than the house itself, carrying the tools of her bondage like trophies she no longer needed. The night had just begun. By dawn, the plantation's silence had teeth. It wasn't the peace of a place at rest, but the pause between 2 breaths before either scream or prayer. Riverton Hall had been built on rhythm. The measured start of work bells, the predictable cadence of pain, the mechanical tick of labor that made the system seem eternal. But now, that rhythm had stopped. The air itself held still, as though the world were trying to decide whether to keep turning. When Jupiter and Abraham finally found their voices, they ran for the main house. Marcus Grayson was already awake, sitting at his desk with a half-written journal entry and a glass of whiskey meant for steadiness. He heard them coming before the knock-heavy feet, stumbling words. Their report was incoherent. Chains broken, men down, blood everywhere. Grayson's first reaction wasn't disbelief. It was irritation. Systems weren't supposed to fail without warning. "You're sure they're dead?" he asked, his tone a bureaucrat's, not a mourner's. Abraham could only nod. "Bring Dr. Pritchard," Grayson ordered. "No one leaves the property." He didn't rush. He walked to the storage building, the way a man walks toward an unpleasant ledger entry that still needs reconciling. By the time he reached the door, the smell had arrived before him: iron, sweat, something raw beneath it. Pritchard arrived moments later, coat unbuttoned, spectacles fogged. Together, they stepped inside. What they saw was less a crime scene than a dismantling of order. The floor ring that had once anchored Sarah's chains had been torn straight from the boards. The table and chairs were splintered, scattered like bones, and the four overseers, Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, Vernon, lay at angles that denied the logic of bone. Their whips, clubs, and iron devices were still nearby, useless in death. Pritchard bent over one of the bodies, his hands trembling in spite of himself. "Blunt force," he muttered. "Heavy, repetitive, God help us, deliberate." Grayson didn't reply. His eyes followed the streaks of blood leading toward the door, where the wood had splintered outward, not inward, a force from within. Sarah had left walking, not fleeing. Behind them, Abraham crossed himself. "She walked past me," he whispered. "Didn't even look scared." "Where did she go?" Grayson asked. Jupiter pointed toward the forge. "She broke the lock, took tools, freed the ones in the punishment room." The words struck like an unthinkable equation. Grayson turned, his voice low. "How many?" "3, Jupiter said. 2 men, 1 woman. They ran into the woods." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the flies beginning their work. Pritchard spoke first. "You realize what this means, Marcus? If this spreads..." Grayson cut him off. "It won't." His tone left no room for doubt. "We contain this. We call it an incident. 4 men lost during an escape attempt. Nothing more." But even as he spoke, he knew control was gone. The quarter doors had been unlocked in the night. No one had tried to run, yet no one had returned to work either. Dozens of eyes watched from behind cracked shutters, the faces expressionless, waiting to see whether dawn itself would burn the old world away. He looked toward the main house. His wife stood on the porch, pale in her nightdress, their children gathered behind her. She clutched her son's shoulder with white knuckles. "Marcus," she called. "Is it true?" He didn't answer. At that moment, a sound rolled across the yard. The steady clank of metal, rhythmically striking wood. Heads turned. From the direction of the forge, a figure emerged, Sarah, moving with the weightless gait of someone who had decided what came next. Her chains were gone, replaced by a hammer in one hand and a chisel in the other. She did not look at the bodies. She did not look at Grayson. She crossed the yard with measured precision, her bare feet silent on the packed clay. When she reached the punishment building, she set down her tools, knelt, and began dismantling the lock with the patience of a craftsman. Within minutes, the door opened. 3 figures stumbled into the dawn, 2 men, 1 woman, blinking against the light. Sarah pointed toward the woods that bordered the western fields. No words, just a gesture, clean and final. They hesitated. She lifted the hammer once, as if to remind them of what would happen if they stayed. They ran. Grayson shouted, "Stop her!" But no one moved. His voice, once a weapon, sounded small against the morning air. Sarah didn't follow the fugitives. Instead, she turned toward the main house. Every door in the quarters opened as she passed. People stood in thresholds, silent, their expressions unreadable. Some bowed their heads. Others simply watched, as if witnessing a verdict being carried out by something older than law. At the steps of Riverton Hall, Sarah stopped. She didn't climb. She looked up at the porch where Grayson stood, gun in hand, his wife clutching the children behind him. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make demands. She only looked, eyes calm, face unreadable. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher. The magistrate, summoned by riders, arrived with 6 armed men, and Dr. Pritchard still pale from the sight inside the holding room. They found Sarah standing exactly where she had been, the yard filled with silent witnesses. The magistrate later wrote in his report, "She offered no resistance. She seemed to have been waiting for us." When the men approached with new chains, thicker, heavier than before, she extended her wrists without protest. The clink of metal sounded almost ceremonial. As they led her away, she looked back only once. Her gaze swept across the crowd, dozens of faces, dark and still, and something in her expression shifted. Not triumph, not sorrow, a kind of understanding. By 7 that morning, the wagon carrying her back toward Charleston rattled down the dirt road, its wheels leaving deep tracks in the red earth. Behind her, Riverton Hall trembled under the weight of what it had witnessed. 4 overseers dead, a system cracked, a story no one would be allowed to tell. Grayson stood in the yard, staring at the blood darkening the planks near the storage room. Dr. Pritchard closed his notebook, the pages trembling in his hands. "You can bury the bodies," he said softly, "but the ground remembers." And for the first time in his life, Marcus Grayson had no entry to make in his journal. The day was beyond measurement. The next time his pen touched paper, it would be to sign a statement for the magistrate, one carefully worded to erase what had truly happened. But not all records burn clean. Weeks later, scraps of testimony, rumors carried by riverboat and letter began to spread beyond Beaufort. A story about a woman who broke her chains, killed 4 men, freed 3 more, and waited at dawn for the law to find her. Each retelling shifted the shape of it. To some, she was a monster. To others, a warning. To a few, a legend. History would remember her by a name she never spoke, Tall Sarah. And though the authorities would try to erase her, the ink of that August morning was already permanent, written not in pen, but in fear. The official inquiry began 5 days later, though everyone already knew the verdict long before the magistrates gathered in the Beaufort courthouse. They wouldn't call it rebellion, not openly. To name it that would mean acknowledging that Riverton Hall, like every plantation around it, stood on a foundation of kindling. Instead, they used words like incident, accident, and necessary loss. But the truth, the one they dared not speak aloud, was that Sarah's silence had terrified them more than her strength. The first testimony came from the 2 men who had stood outside the holding room that night, Jupiter and Abraham. They were still shaking when they took the stand, their eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting to see her there, listening. They told the same story. The sounds of violence from within, the chains snapping, the men screaming. But what the magistrates leaned forward to hear wasn't the sound of violence, it was the silence that followed it. "She didn't cry out?" one of them asked. "No, sir," Abraham said. "Not once. Only, after." A sound like the air itself was breaking. The clerk paused before writing that down. There were no words in his book for something like that. Grayson sat in the front row, his hands folded on his lap like a man trying to remember how prayer worked. He answered questions about procedure, about his methods of labor management, about his purchase of Sarah. He spoke with the precision of a man giving a lecture. "It was an isolated failure," he said. "No evidence of broader agitation." When asked if he had authorized the orientation session, he hesitated. "I was unaware of its timing," he lied, though letters in his desk drawer said otherwise. He could feel the weight of those letters even now, locked in a drawer he prayed no one would open. Then came Dr. Pritchard. He was pale, his hair slicked back as though to restore order when none existed. He described the scene in the holding room, the broken flooring, the shattered furniture, the bodies struck repeatedly by a heavy metallic instrument. He chose his words carefully, but his voice betrayed him. One magistrate leaned forward. "You mean, she beat them?" Pritchard looked down. "She defended herself." The room shifted. That single word, defended, hung in the air like heresy. "You're suggesting provocation?" another magistrate asked sharply. "I'm suggesting sequence," Pritchard said. "Their injuries suggest restraint first, assault after. That's all." The chairman cleared his throat. "Doctor, we are here to determine responsibility, not sequence." But sequence was everything. Outside, the streets of Beaufort buzzed with speculation. 4 dead overseers, 1 surviving woman in chains. The planters whispered that Sarah's body was cursed, her strength unnatural. Some said she was African royalty punished by her own gods, others that she'd made a pact with the devil. The Charleston Mercury printed a single paragraph calling her a specimen of abnormal dimensions before the article vanished from later editions. Yet within the enslaved quarters of South Carolina, the story spread in a different language, through song, through code. They sang of the woman who broke the ring in the floor. They didn't need her name. They called her the tall one, the chain breaker, the one who didn't scream. At the courthouse, the questioning turned practical. What was to be done with her? Execution was the law, but the law had limits, even in the South when money spoke louder. Grayson had paid $3,000 for her. That kind of loss couldn't simply vanish without consequence. Other planters worried about the precedent. If a man could lose that much capital to a single act of resistance, what message did that send? The magistrates debated for hours behind closed doors. The minutes of those meetings survive only in fragments: property value, containment, mental evaluation. The decision, when it came, was both cowardly and calculated. Sarah would not be executed, not yet. She would be transferred to state custody, pending assessment of mental soundness. Grayson would receive partial compensation. The families of the dead overseers would be quietly paid from a communal fund. The inquiry would be sealed, the records classified as sensitive. When the verdict was read, Grayson exhaled, not in relief but exhaustion. The system had survived another test barely, but in private, he knew something irreversible had shifted. That night, in his journal, he wrote only one line: order restored, but not returned. Sarah was moved under guard to Charleston jail. They fitted her with new restraints, custom forged, 20 pounds heavier than the last. The blacksmiths whispered that she'd broken chains stronger than these. The guards avoided her gaze. On the morning of her transfer, a handful of onlookers gathered along the road. Among them were enslaved people from neighboring plantations, allowed to watch as a warning. She sat in the wagon, her posture straight, despite the iron at her wrists and ankles. A preacher shouted, "Repent, and the Lord may forgive you." She didn't look at him. Her eyes traced the horizon, where the sky turned pale gold over the marshes. Inside the courthouse, Dr. Pritchard handed his notes to an assistant. "Lock these away," he said. "If they're ever read in full, they'll burn the whole district down." He kept a private journal instead. In it, he wrote, "She is not mad. She is calculating. The silence is a form of control. I begin to suspect that she learns by watching, that she remembers every restraint, every hinge, every mechanism. Heaven help whoever believes she is broken." He would later regret writing those words, but by then, it would be too late. As the wagon rolled out of Beaufort, a storm gathered behind it, thick with summer humidity and the smell of rain on iron. Some said thunder cracked as she crossed the bridge toward Charleston. Others swore it was the sound of the chains tightening. Either way, the sky itself seemed to take notice, and from that day forward, the planters of Beaufort District began sleeping with lamps lit, because they had seen, for the first time, what their system truly feared: a woman who didn't scream, didn't beg, and didn't run. Charleston, 1848. The jail that received her was built for holding, not remembering thick walls, narrow windows, the air salted by the harbor. Within days, the officials learned that the problem of tall Sarah was not confinement but explanation. She was no longer Marcus Grayson's property, not yet condemned by the court, and too valuable, too dangerous to disappear quietly. She became a line in the governor's ledger under state assets of indeterminate use. Her first weeks there left no trace in the daily register except the same note repeated: no speech, no incident. Yet every man assigned to guard her asked to be reassigned within a month. They said she moved differently at night, that they would hear the faint click of iron and then silence again, as if she were testing the limits of the room a fraction at a time. The warden doubled the locks. She never resisted. When the legislature met that spring, her name surfaced in a conversation about the cost of maintaining unproductive assets. A committee suggested leasing certain prisoners to state work projects. No one said her name, but everyone understood who they meant. A contract was written in bureaucratic language. One female laborer, strong, docile, to be transported under guard to Colombia for quarry work. And so began her second captivity work camps, factories, rail beds, the places where the state buried the evidence of its own machinery. The quarry foreman who first signed her arrival receipt wrote, "Size extraordinary, temper quiet, performs as 3 men." He meant it as praise. After 2 months, he added a new line, "Requires inspection of restraints weekly. Bolts show unusual wear." What none of them realized was that Sarah was studying. Every chain, every rivet, every hinge was a lesson. The rhythm of labor became her textbook. She learned how stones split under pressure, how timber groaned before it broke, how men shouted orders when afraid. She spoke rarely. When she did, her voice surprised them, low, calm, a trace of Virginia in the vowels. One day, a younger worker dropped his chisel, shattering his hand. The foreman shouted for help, but before anyone moved, Sarah tore a strip from her sleeve and bound the wound, tightening the cloth with the precision of a surgeon. The bleeding stopped. The man lived. Later, he would tell others, "She knew what to do. She always knows." By autumn, she was moved again to a rice mill near Georgetown, then to the railroad project cutting through pine forest inland. Each transfer came after security concerns that no report explained. At the mill, she had learned the turning of cogs. At the railroad, she watched how bridges were built to bear their own weight. At every site, something small went wrong, a loosened shackle, a misplaced key, and supervisors wrote that she required stricter oversight. None suspected that she wanted observation itself, to understand how systems saw her, how fear traveled through a chain of command. In the records of those years, her name appears beside numbers, tons of stone moved, sacks of grain lifted. But in the margins of one report, written faintly by a clerk whose handwriting trembled, are 6 words. She watches, she remembers, she waits. By 1850, her reputation had reached beyond the camps. A Charleston medical journal published a paper titled "Observations on Physiological Extremes Among the Negro Race." The author did not name her, but the description was unmistakable. The article speculated about bone density, unusual height and musculature, and mental calm under duress. It ended with a call for systematic study. That article found its way to Augusta, Georgia, to a man named Dr. Franklin L. Hayes, physician, anatomist, and evangelist for a new kind of science that measured morality in inches and skulls. He wrote to the South Carolina authorities, offering a solution to their inconvenient prisoner: "Transfer her to my care for scientific examination." His letter dripped with respectability. "The subject represents an unprecedented opportunity for physiological advancement," he wrote, promising that his experiments would benefit labor management throughout the South. What he meant was simple. He wanted to own what he could not create. The officials agreed. Anything to move her elsewhere, to make the ghost of Riverton Hall someone else's burden. The paperwork called it a research lease. She would remain state property, but under Hayes's supervision, in a private facility built for the humane study of exceptional specimens. When the wagon came for her again, she did not resist. 2 guards, older men by then, said later that she looked almost peaceful, as if being transferred was part of a map only she could see. Dr. Hayes's compound sat on the edge of Augusta, a former warehouse turned laboratory, its windows barred not for security but to keep questions from escaping. He met the wagon in person, short and precise, hair already white from study. "Remarkable," he whispered when he saw her step down. "Perfect symmetry." He led her inside, past rows of instruments gleaming with promise and threat. To him, she was a data point, an exotic equation waiting to be solved. To her, he was another lesson. Within weeks, he began the series of examinations that would later make his name and haunt it. He measured her every dimension, catalogued her heartbeat under stress, tested her reaction to cold, to heat, to pain. Through it all, Sarah remained still, silent, watching. Hayes mistook patience for dullness. He didn't realize she was memorizing the sequence of every latch and lock, the pattern of his assistant's keys, the timing of his routines. In the evenings, when the corridors emptied and the lamps dimmed, she would sit in the half-light of her cell, running her fingers along the iron cuff, counting the turns of each screw. She had learned by now that every system contained the blueprint of its own undoing. In one of his early reports, Hayes wrote, Subject displays no emotion, no apparent understanding of her condition. I suspect limited intellect. He would change that assessment soon enough, because Sarah had begun, in her quiet way, to conduct her own experiments. By the winter of 1851, Dr. Franklin Hayes believed he had tamed the mystery. He told his colleagues that the woman from South Carolina was no longer a threat, but a phenomenon under observation. He kept meticulous notes, drawing diagrams of bone and muscle, recording pulse and respiration with a zeal that passed for devotion. To visitors, he spoke of science, of the hidden laws of strength, but in the privacy of his journal, the tone changed. "She unnerves me," he wrote. "Her eyes anticipate the question before I ask it. I have the strange sensation that it is I who am being studied." He was right. Sarah had stopped resisting long ago. She complied with every command, allowed him to measure, to prod, to record. The more obedient she seemed, the more careless he became. She noticed that he carried 3 keys, one on a chain around his neck, one in his waistcoat, and a spare he kept on a hook beside the door. She memorized which key fit which lock. She learned the pattern of his assistant's steps in the corridor, the shift changes, the hour the lamps were trimmed. Every examination became an exchange. Hayes believed he was extracting data. Sarah was collecting something far more useful, knowledge. He brought in puzzles to test her cognition, interlocking brass rings, sliding bars, locks that required sequence to open. She solved each within minutes, then sat quietly, dismantling the pieces with her fingers until she understood the mechanism. "She shows mechanical reasoning uncommon among her race," Hayes wrote, as though the words excused his astonishment. He did not notice the faint smile that touched her mouth when he turned away. Weeks became months. Her body bore scars from earlier punishments, but her mind remained untouched, sharp. Hayes's curiosity darkened into obsession. He began speaking to her even when she didn't answer, explaining his theories aloud, pacing the room. She listened the way a blacksmith listens to metal, hearing what it can become. One evening he pricked her palm with a scalpel, studying how quickly the wound closed. "Does it hurt?" he asked, almost kindly. She looked at him, then at the instrument, then at the open journal on the table. Finally, she spoke for the first time in months. "Only when you write." He froze, the quill suspended mid-air. "What did you say?" She didn't repeat it. She simply turned her gaze toward the door, waiting for him to leave. That night, Hayes wrote 10 pages, trying to parse the meaning of her words. He convinced himself it was coincidence, a random sentence remembered from before. But deep down, he felt the tremor of something larger, an intelligence testing its cage. In March of 1852, Hayes hosted a small demonstration for 5 physicians from Charleston and Savannah. Among them was Dr. Pritchard, older now, still haunted by Riverton Hall. Hayes wanted to show Sarah's physical endurance. The experiment was cruel even by his standards: sustained stress under heat, pulse readings at intervals, pain tolerance recorded in minutes. The visitors stood uneasy as he continued far past decency. Pritchard finally intervened. "Enough, Franklin. You're not measuring science, you're measuring your own cruelty." Sarah, still bound, turned her head toward the older doctor. "You remember," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Her voice was low but steady, the cadence educated, deliberate. Pritchard met her eyes. "Yes," he whispered. Hayes called off the demonstration. His colleagues left disturbed, muttering that he had gone too far. That night, in his notes, Hayes admitted to fear. "She spoke in full sentences. The accent is Virginia, her tone precise. I sense calculation rather than madness. She could end me if she wished." He didn't sleep that night, neither did she. From then on, their relationship shifted. Hayes began questioning her as though speaking to a peer. He asked where she had learned to read human anatomy so intuitively, how she could locate the body's weak points with such precision. Sometimes she answered, sometimes not. Once, when he asked what she wanted, she said, "To understand how strength becomes freedom." He took it as metaphor. It wasn't. By summer, the guards noticed subtle changes. She moved more freely within the cell, always returning before inspection. The locks showed no marks, yet their tension felt different, looser. One assistant swore he saw her tracing the seam of the door with her fingertips, as if mapping it. Hayes installed new restraints, heavier bolts. She complied as always, offering her wrists. He thought that meant surrender. In September 1852, he presented his findings to the Southern Medical Society, 30 pages of measurements, 6 anatomical sketches, and a conclusion that strength without intellect was merely instinct. The applause satisfied him. He did not notice that, back in the laboratory, the woman he had measured was waiting in the dark, her fingers already turning the last of the new bolts. The final entry in his private journal before everything changed reads, "She has begun to ask questions about the heart, not metaphoric anatomical. She wants to know where the pulse is most vulnerable. She asks too much." 3 nights later, when he returned to the laboratory after midnight, the door to her cell was open. The cuffs lay on the floor, unbroken but unlocked. The lamps still burned. On the table sat a folded note in a hand he did not recognize but could not mistake. "Dr. Hayes, you taught me how the body fails and how the mind endures. You taught me patience by testing mine. You taught me that knowledge is freedom, even when written in pain. I have learned enough. If you pursue me, remember what you showed me about the heart." Sarah. He stood for a long time, reading the lines again and again, unable to decide whether they were threat or farewell. He never reported her escape that night. Instead, he burned his notes and told his assistants she had been transferred. For weeks, he slept with a pistol under his pillow. By the time the state demanded an update, Sarah was already gone, vanished into the forests that stretched north beyond Augusta, into a darkness that no one in the South dared follow. The official report would later call it a containment failure, but the truth was simpler. The woman they thought they had broken had spent years learning how everything around her worked: locks, chains, men, and when the time came, she simply opened the door. For nearly 2 years after the night she vanished from Dr. Hayes's laboratory, the South told stories about her, the way children whisper ghost tales by firelight. A 7-foot woman moving north through pine forests, leaving broken locks behind her. Farmers in Georgia claimed they saw a shadow cross their fields at dusk, tall enough to brush the branches. Sheriffs in the Carolinas blamed her for escaped prisoners, though none could explain how a fugitive that size could vanish without a trace. But the official search ended quietly. Hayes never pressed the matter. He told the authorities she drowned in the Savannah River while attempting escape, and they accepted it, because the alternative, a woman like that, free and thinking, was too dangerous to imagine. By the spring of 1854, Sarah was no longer a rumor in the South. She was a legend carried northward by travelers who spoke her name in low voices. And then, suddenly, she became real again. In Chester County, Pennsylvania, a farming community of free black families began reporting strange occurrences. Tools repaired overnight. Wagon wheels mended, though no one had touched them. The broken plow at Isaiah Freeman's farm found fixed at dawn. The iron fused clean. Neighbors joked about a guardian spirit in the woods until someone saw her. A young boy, walking home from the mill road, described a woman tall as 2 men standing between the trees, watching him with calm eyes. He said she wore rough clothes, carried nothing, and disappeared when he blinked. The story spread through the town before the boy reached his door. Isaiah Freeman, a blacksmith and community leader, didn't laugh. He'd heard whispers on the Underground Railroad about a giant woman who'd escaped from Georgia, a woman who freed others as she fled. He began leaving messages at the edge of the forest. Short notes written on birch bark. "You are welcome here. You are safe." For weeks, there was no reply. But small things kept happening. A barn fire extinguished before dawn. A missing mule found tied at the gate, calm and fed. Then one morning, Freeman found a response pinned to the same birch tree where he left his notes. The words, written in charcoal, were simple. "I mean no harm. I am learning how free people live." It was signed only S. The Freemans talked late into the night about what to do. His wife, Rachel, a schoolteacher, urged compassion. "If the stories are true, she's been caged her whole life," she said. "Let her come when she's ready." Isaiah agreed. They continued leaving messages, small offerings of food, water, and trust. In November of 1856, she finally stepped out of the trees. The first thing Isaiah noticed was her silence, not fearful, but deliberate, the kind of quiet that has learned to listen before it speaks. The second was her eyes, the same amber color Dr. Pritchard had once called calculating. She had lost none of her power, though her body was leaner now, hardened by years in the wilderness. "I'm the woman you heard about," she said softly. "From Georgia, but they called me property when they had no right." Isaiah nodded. "You're safe here," he said. She didn't answer. Her gaze swept across the small clearing, the smoke rising from the forge, the sound of children's laughter drifting from the house. After a long moment, she said, "I'll stay near, not with you, not yet." For months, she lived at the edge of the woods in a small shed Isaiah built from spare timber. She worked at night, mending tools, moving lumber, clearing fields before dawn. The children grew used to her shape, moving between the trees like a shadow. Rachel visited often, bringing bread and questions she didn't expect answered. Slowly, Sarah began to talk. Not about Riverton Hall or Dr. Hayes, those names stayed buried, but about the present. She asked how schools worked, how people decided who led a community, how freedom was kept. Rachel explained, and Sarah listened, nodding as if measuring the idea's strength. She started helping with larger work, raising barns, digging wells. When a storm flattened part of the church roof, she repaired the beams herself, lifting them as though they were nothing. The men who watched her work stopped seeing a monster and started seeing a miracle. One night, Rachel asked her directly, "Do you ever think about going further north? Canada, maybe?" Sarah looked toward the horizon. "I've had enough of running," she said. "Freedom isn't where you hide, it's what you build." Over time, the Freemans realized she had an engineer's mind. She studied how their tools fit together, how the mill's gears worked, how water moved through the blacksmith's bellows. Sometimes she would take apart a device entirely, then rebuild it faster, cleaner. When Rachel asked why, Sarah said, "Understanding keeps fear away. If I can build it, it can't own me." Her presence changed the town. People began bringing her problems to solve: broken plows, jammed presses, cracked axles. She fixed them all, wordlessly, efficiently. Children followed her around, fearless now, fascinated by her height. She laughed for the first time that winter, an abrupt, rusty sound, like something rediscovered. Rachel later wrote in her journal, "It was the sound of a door opening where none had been before, but the world beyond their valley hadn't forgotten the South's unfinished business." In early 1857, word came that a man from Charleston was asking questions along the railroad line, a recovery agent, looking for an unusually tall woman last seen in Augusta. The Fugitive Slave Act still gave men like him the authority to drag the past north in chains. The Freemans warned Sarah to leave, but she shook her head. "If I run again, I'll always be running. If I stay, maybe they'll learn what freedom looks like when it stops hiding." So the community gathered. They forged an unspoken pact. No one saw her, no one knew her, no one talked. When the bounty hunter arrived, he found polite silence and empty roads. Children played dumb. Men worked without looking up. Sarah kept working in the forge at night, hammering quietly, shaping iron into plowshares, tools, things meant to build rather than break. The sound carried through the trees, steady, rhythmic, defiant. In the morning, when Isaiah checked the forge, he found something new hanging from the rafter. A single chain link, forged open and left unfinished. Beside it, scratched into the wood, were two words: "Still learning." The man from Charleston left within a week. Life in Chester County went on, as it always does after fear passes through and leaves people braver than before. And Sarah, for the first time since Riverton Hall, began to believe that surviving wasn't the same as living. By 1858, the tall woman who had once terrified an entire district of South Carolina was simply Miss Sarah to the people of Chester County. The children brought her wildflowers. The men asked her opinion about building bridges over the creek. The women trusted her strength when the harvest came and storms rolled in from the hills. Yet beneath the routine of farm life, traces of the old fear lingered. She still slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. She still preferred to sit near doorways, where exits were visible. Freedom, she had learned, was fragile, a light that had to be guarded even in the safest places. One evening, as the Freemans finished dinner, Rachel noticed Sarah standing by the forge, staring at the flames as if reading something written there. "You never rest," Rachel said gently. Sarah's eyes didn't leave the fire. "Rest is for people who've finished learning. What is it you're trying to learn now?" How to live without waiting for footsteps behind me, Sarah answered. How to stop expecting someone to turn a key. Rachel wanted to reach out, but she understood that this woman had built her survival on the distance between herself and others. So instead she simply said, "Then stay, as long as it takes." And she did. Over the next 2 years, Sarah became the quiet heart of the Freeman community. She built her own cabin on a plot of land that Isaiah deeded to her name, the first legal ownership she had ever held. She worked the soil until her palms bled and then worked some more, discovering a strange peace in the predictability of growth, seed, sun, rain, harvest. Children visited often, fascinated by her hands, by the stories she never quite finished telling. She showed them how to fix broken wagon wheels, how to sharpen tools, how to lift with balance instead of force. One boy later said, "She taught us to be strong without being cruel." But even as she began to settle, history was tightening its grip elsewhere. The nation was sliding toward war. The headlines spoke of secession, of blood, of old chains reforged in new shapes. The Freemans followed every rumor, every law passed by men who believed freedom was a thing to be debated. When the Fugitive Slave Act was renewed in harsher terms, bounty hunters returned to Pennsylvania in greater numbers. In the spring of 1860, one of them, Walter Pembroke of Charleston, arrived in Chester County with a worn description of a 7-foot-tall woman, property of the late Franklin Hayes, Augusta. He rode into town on a gray horse, polite but cold. "I'm told you have a giant here," he said to Isaiah at the blacksmith shop. "A miracle worker, they call her. You can save us both trouble if you tell me where she is." Isaiah met his gaze evenly. "We don't deal in miracles here, only work." Pembroke smiled thinly. "If I find her myself, the law will come down on this whole town." Sarah was in the forge when Isaiah told her what had happened. She listened without emotion, wiping soot from her arms. "He won't find what he's looking for," she said. Isaiah frowned. "You don't understand how these men think." "I understand exactly," she said. "They think in lines, orders, chains, papers. Freedom doesn't fit on paper." That night, the community gathered in the church basement. They argued whether to hide her, to send her farther north, maybe to Canada. Sarah waited until the room fell quiet. Then she stood, her head nearly brushing the rafters. "I'm tired of running," she said simply. "If they come, let them see what freedom looks like when it stands its ground." Her words hung in the air like a bell tone, deep and final. Rachel Freeman later wrote in her journal, "It wasn't defiance in her voice, it was acceptance, the calm of someone who has already measured the cost and chosen to pay it." The next morning, Sarah walked into town at sunrise, her shoulders straight, her hands empty. People watched from doorways as she went to the smithy, lit the forge, and began to work. When Pembroke arrived, following the sound of the hammer, she looked up from the anvil, eyes level with his fear. "You're trespassing," she said. He tried to draw his pistol, but something in her stillness stopped him. The barrel wavered. "I don't want trouble," he said finally. "The law says." "The law once said I was property," she interrupted. "If that was a lie, then maybe this is too." Pembroke hesitated. The heat from the forge shimmered between them. Behind him, the townspeople began to gather, quiet, solid, unarmed, but unyielding. In their faces, he saw what every slaver feared most: unity. He holstered the pistol. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "Maybe," Sarah said, "but it'll be mine to make." He left town before nightfall. Letters later uncovered in a Charleston archive revealed that Pembroke had written to Dr. Hayes for confirmation of ownership. Hayes, now an old man, replied with a single line, "Let the matter rest. Some lessons are better left unlearned." The community never forgot that week. From then on, they spoke of Sarah not as fugitive but as neighbor. She became the silent guardian of the valley, her presence, a promise that fear would not return unchallenged. When war came, she worked beside the men building defenses for the Union militias. She lifted timbers, forged tools, and taught the younger soldiers how to reinforce structures under fire. To them, she was not myth or legend, but living proof that strength could serve life instead of death. After the war, when the first whispers of Reconstruction reached Pennsylvania, Sarah refused any talk of reward or recognition. "Freedom given is just another kind of chain," she said. "The only kind that lasts is built with your own hands." By 1867, She had turned her forge into a workshop for teaching blacksmithing, carpentry, and the craft of self-reliance. Clara, a newly escaped woman from Maryland, became her apprentice. The two worked side by side for years, building plows, tools, and sometimes silence. Clara once said, "Miss Sarah never taught with words. She taught by standing beside you until you remembered you were strong." The children who had grown up in her shadow now brought their own to learn. They built barns, fences, and futures. In 1872, Rachel Freeman recorded a conversation she had with Sarah by the fire. "Do you ever regret what happened in South Carolina?" she asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't regret surviving," she said. "I regret the years it took to learn what survival meant." What does it mean now? It means building something that doesn't need chains to stand. When Sarah died in the winter of 1889, the entire valley came to her burial, farmers, freedmen, children now grown. Her gravestone was simple: Sarah 1824, 1889. She survived to live. No mention of Riverton Hall, no mention of the chains, just the truth she had earned. In the decades that followed, her cabin decayed, her forge rusted. But when children asked about the old woman in the woods who once fixed everything, the elders smiled and said, "She learned how to turn pain into work and work into freedom." The South forgot her name. The North never quite believed she existed. But in the small circle of earth where she is buried, the soil still yields more than it should, as if remembering the hands that once shaped it. And if you walk through the fields of Chester County on a still night, when the air is thick with summer heat, you might hear the faint rhythm of a hammer striking iron, steady, patient, and free. Time does what even iron cannot. It softens. By the 1890 seconds, the people who had known Sarah began to fade one by one, and her story, like most truths too heavy for textbooks, slipped into the hush of memory. The Freedmen's Bureau never wrote her name. The local newspapers never printed her death. History, polite as always, averted its gaze. But in Chester County, there were still traces. The children who had watched her at the forge grew into parents who taught their own children the lessons she had left behind. They did not talk about Riverton Hall or the killing in South Carolina. They talked about steadiness, patience, precision, how to keep your hands working even when your heart breaks. She said the world could be remade with the same hands that broke it, one granddaughter recalled. The Freemans kept her grave clean, planting wild lilies each spring. Rachel lived long enough to see new generations grow up free. When she was too frail to walk, she asked to be carried one last time to Sarah's resting place. She touched the stone and whispered, "You kept your promise." For a while, that was enough. Then, in 1903, a local school teacher began collecting oral histories from older residents for a pamphlet on the early Negro settlements of Pennsylvania. She visited the Freeman descendants, who told her about the tall woman who worked the forge. The teacher wrote down every detail: her height, her silence, the way she once stared into fire as if seeing the past there. But when she asked for Sarah's last name, they told her there wasn't one. She said she'd had enough names given to her by other people. The pamphlet was never published. It sits, still bound in string, in a box marked Local Legends in a county archive. On its final page is a sentence the teacher added in pencil. Some say, "On quiet nights, the ring of her hammer can still be heard near the creek." The line might have been sentiment, or maybe she had heard something she couldn't explain. Far to the south, the land that had once been Riverton Hall changed hands a dozen times. The cotton fields turned to scrub, then to swamp, then to forest again. The Grayson house collapsed, its columns sinking into the mud. Hunters who ventured there in later years said the ground felt wrong, soft, as if remembering too much. In 1921, a survey team from the University of South Carolina stumbled on the ruins. They catalogued artifacts: rusted iron fittings, fragments of pottery, a handful of ledgers sealed in tin boxes beneath the foundation. One ledger, when opened, revealed familiar handwriting: August 1847, acquisition complete, subject delivered without incident, all in order. The next page had been torn clean out. When the researchers published their findings, they made no mention of Sarah. The report called the site a representative example of coastal plantation economy. But one assistant, a young black man who had grown up hearing whispers about a woman who broke her chains, copied down a few of the entries for himself. Years later, his granddaughter would find them among his papers and recognize the name Grayson. The story began to stitch itself together again. By the 1952, historians of the Civil War era had begun re-examining plantation records, searching for voices that had been silenced. One, a professor from Howard University, found Dr. Pritchard's long-forgotten journals in a Charleston library. Most of the entries were clinical, but one caught his attention. "I have seen many bodies broken in the name of discipline, but never one that refused the language of pain." She understood that silence is not surrender, but selection. The moment she chose to break it, she would end us. The professor followed the trail north to Augusta, to Chester County. What he found there astonished him. Multiple independent oral histories describing a woman of extraordinary stature, a blacksmith, a teacher, a survivor who had arrived from the south in the mid-1850s. The dates aligned too perfectly to dismiss. When he published his paper, Tall Sarah, a case study in the recovered voices of the antebellum South, scholars dismissed it as folklore, a merging of slave mythology and local legend. But among communities descended from freedmen, the story rang true. And sometimes, truth survives not in archives but in the rhythm of belief. By the turn of the century, Sarah's name began appearing in sermons, in speeches about endurance and faith. Preachers told of a woman who broke the chains that held 100 souls. Activists in the 1960s quoted her supposed words, "Freedom isn't where you hide, it's what you build." No one could prove she said it, but no one doubted it either. In 1989, on the centennial of her death, a small group of historians and local residents placed a new marker beside her weathered stone in the Freeman Cemetery. It read, "Tall Sarah, born enslaved, died free." Her silence spoke for thousands. That night, after the dedication, an old woman who claimed descent from one of the freed prisoners of Riverton Hall told a story to the gathered crowd. "My great-grandmother," said Sarah once told her, "every chain teaches you something. Some teach you how to break them, others teach you what not to forge." When the crowd left, the wind rose through the trees, carrying the faint metallic echo of something striking iron, though no forge had burned there for 100 years. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps memory has its own kind of sound. But those who heard it swore the rhythm was steady. 3 beats, a pause, then one more like a code tapped against the walls of history, reminding anyone willing to listen that silence, too, can be a language. And somewhere, in the soil that once stained the boots of overseers, a woman's story buried, erased, forgotten, kept breathing, because some stories, once learned, refused to stay caged. It would take another century before historians finally acknowledged her existence without hesitation. For decades, she hovered between fact and folklore, too extraordinary for scholars to accept, too precise for storytellers to have invented. But every generation that rediscovered her left the story sharper, harder to ignore. In 2003, a restoration project at the South Carolina Historical Society uncovered a misfiled box labeled Riverton Misc Ledgers 1840, 1850. Inside were brittle papers eaten by time, but one survived intact, a bill of sale. The name Sarah, age 3, 0 approx infos, Virginia-born, sold as is appeared in faded ink, along with a signature that matched Marcus Grayson's hand. It was the first irrefutable document tying the legend to a real person. 2 months later, forensic historians re-examined the 1,921 excavation notes from Riverton Hall. Buried among mundane plantation debris, they had catalogued something dismissed as iron fragments. When the box was reopened, the pieces formed a chain link 4 inches wide, twice the thickness of standard restraints, broken clean through. Tests confirmed what the records already whispered. No ordinary human could have done that barehanded. The discovery reignited interest. Documentarians came, academics lectured, articles appeared with titles like "The Giant of Riverton Hall," "Fact or Allegory," and "Strength and Silence, the Forgotten Resistance." But for people whose families had once whispered about her by firelight, she had never been forgotten. In Chester County, descendants of the Freeman settlement began an oral history project, recording the memories passed down through generations. One of them, a 4-year-old woman named Miriam Carter, remembered her grandmother's words. Miss Sarah said every lock is just a question waiting for the right answer. And she found all the answers. When Miriam's recording aired in a public radio feature, it caught the attention of a sculptor from Philadelphia. She traveled to the Freeman Cemetery and stood before the stone that read, "She survived to live." A month later, she unveiled a life-sized sculpture not of a warrior, but of a woman seated at a forge, hammer in hand, her expression calm and focused. The inscription read, "Freedom is built, not bestowed." Crowds came from across the country to see it. Teachers brought students, mothers brought daughters, and somewhere between the murmurs and the silence, people began to realize that Sarah's story wasn't about strength at all. It was about transformation, about what happens when someone turns pain into purpose so completely that even their absence becomes a kind of guidance. Her story began in chains, but it ended in hands that made things. And in that journey from Riverton Hall's cellar to the forge in Pennsylvania, from nightmare to legacy lies the reason her name still moves through time like a steady hammer strike. Every age has its own kind of bondage, and every generation must learn again how to break what confines it. Sarah's lesson was never about vengeance. It was about the quiet power of construction, building life where destruction once ruled, finding patience where rage would have sufficed, and teaching others, simply by example, that endurance itself can be a form of resistance. In her final years, Sarah had said very little about her past, but the words she left carved above her workshop door in rough iron letters remained long after her death. What you build is what survives. Maybe that's why, when the wind moves through the Freeman Valley today, the blacksmith's rhythm seems to echo faintly, not haunting, not tragic, but resolute. The sound of work continuing, the sound of freedom maintained, one strike at a time. Because tall Sarah never wanted to be remembered as the woman who killed her overseers. She wanted to be remembered as the woman who learned to live. And she was.